Hi everyone, welcome back to another character speed draw, pixelart speed draw. This one's a little special. This is a redesign for a character, the main character in my game I'm working on currently. It's a restaurant sim, and usually when I make my sprites, I start on the eye. But this time around, since it's a restaurant sim and the character will have to serve her food, the idea was that, okay, how big does the tray need to be that she holds the food of? And so once I figure that out, I can make the sprite from there. So it starts off with the tray, as the tray is the most important part of the character. So if I can get the tray right, I can kind of continuously edit the character. And then you can see on the side here, trying to figure out her eyes now. I usually go eyes, then body. Here I did tray, then eyes. I'm trying to mess around here with expressions and figure out how her eye can work. This is a goth character. She's a necromancer, but she's supposed to be this kind of scary, cute character. I thought maybe adding the eye bags would kind of help, and here I'm trying to morph the face. You can kind of see when you make it really skinny, it kind of makes it look like a skeleton, but I wanted to go for cute instead of horrifying. So after I kind of get the idea of the face down, I'm kind of messing with hairstyles. On the right, you can see previous designs I've done for her, or just previous drawings. I'll show it up on screen. This is her current sprite, and it kind of flashes a little bit too. So the idea here is to make a new sprite for the game I'm working on. So the idea is that I'll have the idle, the moving, all of those things, and that'll be based around how big and how well she can hold the tray. So here I'm trying to figure out the robe, and thought, okay, maybe a new robe design. I'm trying to figure out the overall shape of everything. I want the tray to be visible, and I want her body to be visible. I'm trying to figure out here her positioning of her arms. I'm looking at references for holding trays, and I'm trying to see something that looks comfortable and looks like she could actually hold. And looking at a lot of different pictures where there's some where the hands are through the loops, you can kind of see her legs look really tall, so I'm just trying to keep in mind perspective and proportions in her body, and just seeing what feels right to me. Once I figure out a good size that I want her sprite to overall have, I can move on to the idle, but for now I'm just trying to figure out the general. This is kind of the sketch of everything. It's the basis. She has little elf ears, not because she's an elf, but they're magicians, they're wizards, they're magical. So I give her little elf ears. She's always had the elf ears. I might go back and change that. They're defining details. They're elf ears, pigtails with little skull parts on the pigtails. So those are the key things I want to keep in mind, as well as her droopy eyes. That's the main focus after I figure out the overall shoulder shape. Here I'm trying to make sure, okay, we don't want her to look too bulky. Not too bulky, because this is still such a small pixel art size. Any pixels that you remove change a lot. And she's a very classy lady. She comes from a very high class family. So I added little heels, not that the sprite is large enough to do so. I'm trying to add an overall feel of the robe and the sprite. So once I figure out that, I move on to actually making the idle sprite. After I figure out the overall size, and I'm kind of comparing and contrasting previous sprites that I've made, and also sprites that I take inspiration from, for example, from Deltarune or the Pokemon games. I'm looking at those and thinking, okay, how big is mine compared to those? Once I go from there, I then kind of flesh out her overall body and shape and size. Here I'm going and I'm trying to take her previous drawings that I've done, look them over, and go from there and making a new design. I want to keep her overall cloak, but it just needs to be a little bit upgraded, and now that I have more space, I can make it bigger as well. So I'm going around here with the trim, the rim, trying to add shading, and trying to show off the different portions of her body. I'm not very good at clothing, but I can pat myself on the back a little bit here, and the fact that I think it came out a lot better than it did the first time, which is on the right. And I'm enjoying it. I can see my progression, and that's always what I hope for when I do pixel art. Here I'm kind of having a little bit of trouble with her hands and figuring out nice positioning. Her hands were kind of looking a little funny, so I go in first and I add that upper part of the cloak. I'm adding a, what would you call it, a lace, the part that holds it together. I thought silver might work, but it looked a little funny, so I left the trim at the outer edges. That way the part that holds everything together can just be gold to kind of highlight everything, as once I figure out the overall design of her, that's what all the other customers would be. And you can see here as well, since I couldn't get her hands to work at her side, I thought, okay, let's just put her hands together. She's a little bit of a nervous wreck, so her kind of fiddling with her hands in front of her makes sense. It's also a more ladylike pose, if I do say so myself, when you fold your hands in front of your dress. And here I kind of realize she's a little bit too wide and a little bit too bulky. So I'm going in and I'm just squishing her body, squishing everything to make her seem a little bit thinner, as right now it feels a little bit too big, wide. And I'm realizing that I can't add the one dot that I had for her eyes if I want it to be even or odd. It was 4 wide. No, it was 1 wide. Now it's 2 wide. So it makes it a little bit easier, and I kind of have her fingers pressing against each other, that signature emote, as I think that would be her kind of idle waiting. She's a little nervous. Here I'm trying to round out her body and just overall make sure it stays thin. That's the overall goal, is just to make sure it's not too big. We want to seem cool and classy, and that usually comes with very thin shapes instead of very round and big shapes. More so thinner ones is what I'm going for here. I'm just overall trying to get the idea and design down. I'm figuring out where the overall shading goes on the clothing, and I'm kind of comparing and contrasting with the clothing from the Pokemon games I'm looking at, and I'm just making sure that she gets bulked down, moving the dress down to make it longer frame. I'm thinking about the silhouette in the sense that wide and stout, or wide and short versus tall and long. You can kind of see. I even debated a little bit on to do both and kind of make it a multi-layer, but I go back. And then here I'm doing a bit of anti-aliasing. I've been trying to get a little bit better at that. It's a kind of blending technique where you mix 2 colors together that you want to blend together. So it's kind of 50% one color, 50% the other. I make the darker part of the clothing line darker. A darker part of the clothing. The bottom of the clothing line is dark. The top part of the clothing line is light to kind of show off shading. And then once I figure that out, here I'm trying to mess around with her hair. I'm trying to keep the style of her pigtails alive, but since I have a little bit more space, I'm trying to see what I can invent and see what I can get away with now that she is far bigger than she was before. After that, I move on to making her back sprite. I don't do everything in this video, but I do finish up her front. The idea was just to make sure it worked front, back, and sideways, or to her side. So I'm trying to overall just get a kind of general idea of how it might look like from the back, how it will look like from the front, and how it will look like from the side. I'm messing around with lines and seeing, okay, how would the ripples of the fabric and the clothing kind of align together? So I'm going back and forth with, you can kind of see, she kind of looks like an owl from this angle. But here, I realize, okay, I don't know how her hair would look like from the front. So once I figure out the silhouette for her back, then I can kind of edit it. And like I said before, with her signature pendants, or I think they're called pendants, with the skulls, that's the key point I want to make sure that's obvious and bright. So after that, I kind of go in and I'm just testing and messing around with different shapes and styles. I thought, okay, maybe some fancy hair swirls, and I kind of give that a try. You can see I take her previous Sprite that I've been using and add that in, and kind of come up with this little fancy hairdo. I think it's a little fancy. I quite don't like it a little bit, but I think it might have to just grow on me. But I add a more so outline, and you can kind of see these spaces I'm leaving are kind of the shiny part I'm thinking, but later on I kind of go back and tweak it. Here I'm kind of just reviewing other sprites from different games and different creators and seeing how they do front, as this game is top down, but I'm looking at these sprites and they just seem head on straightforward. So after I come up with a design for the front, I then move on to the side. Here all I'm just trying to do is make sure it works. It doesn't need to be cleaned up correctly, it just needs to make sense and kind of be tweakable once I figure everything out. So I kind of try to imagine her body at a side angle, I imagine her face, and then work on her eyes, and this is a little tricky, but it definitely helped in figuring out, okay, her eyes are just basically right now currently straightforward, so you kind of have to make the eyes thinner and make her pupils go forward, and I don't know if I do it at the moment. I definitely go back and change it. Right now I'm messing with the hair and tweaking it, and I'm waiting for me to mess with the eyes, as they kind of look a little wonky at the moment. I'm keeping in mind the overall hair size, hair shape, and trying to make sure that looks nice, and then I go back in. I should edit the eyes soon if I give myself a little bit of a moment. And right now I'm just measuring and making sure the hair lines up with the front and hopefully the back and everything else like that. I'm trying to make sure my colors are right, kind of checking them and making sure the lightest values, darkest values, all of those kind of mesh in well. The goal of doing these at least is they're supposed to be temporary, just a morsel sketch to make sure the idea works. As if this isn't working, then I kind of have to go back and redo things. So kind of just making a proof of concept, so to speak, kind of going in, checking and saying, okay, if the hair looks like this, does it look nice? Does it not look nice? Do I need to add some shading here, remove some shading? You can see I'm trying to modify shading on the face, and here's where I go and under the eyes. You can see how that small change of just changing the size of the eye helps a lot, and just changing the overall. You can kind of see me flicking back and forth as I'm a little surprised. I have to keep in mind as well that I'll be adding on her hat later, so I don't add a lot of detail on the top of her head. And then after that, I move on to, what do we move on to? I can't really see the bottom, but I do recall. So yeah, now I add on the hat. I thought, okay, maybe I could just copy and paste the hat, but I can't. So now I'm looking at references of big witch hats and trying to see if I can make it a little bit cooler than I did before. I'm going through and doing a few sketches and trying to figure out the overall shape and pattern, and I think this is the one I end up sticking with. I'm keeping in mind that golden trim that starts off, then the purple, and then the kind of swoop that happens, as I'm gonna have to animate this, so it should be easy shapes that I can do, or fingers crossed at least. Might have to go and re-edit it. I'm trying to keep in mind the trim, the overall curves. I'm rounding things out, and I'm just adding a light shading so it looks like it's coming from back and front. And then after that, I go in and what do I do? Let's see. I'm going around and trying to figure out how the hat would look from behind. Now I have done it, like I said before, with the old Sprite. The old Sprite is smaller though, it's a little bit trickier, and this hat's a little bit of a different design. So I'm just trying to imagine how the hat might look like from the back, from the front, and kind of smoothing out the edges, adding shading here and there to kind of hopefully help make it look rounder. I definitely think I'll be changing this, but for now it's just an idea, okay, of how would this look from this angle, what would the idea look from this angle, as I'm most certainly going to come back and edit these. This is just to get down a general basis of the design, and then I'll come back and kind of clean everything up once I can and once it's nice and done. So I'm just going around and making sure all of the hat looks good from each angle. I'll have to, because the hat leans to one side, the thing is I have to have the hat sprite two different ways, one for when she's facing left and one for when she's facing the right. It's a little off. But after that, for the longest time, I had her have the eye bags, but I removed those and realizing, okay, it makes her look a little bit too old. The idea was to hopefully make her look sleepy, but she doesn't look sleepy as much as she looks older. And she's not older. She's in her 20s. This is a college she's going to. Well, say 20s. She's probably more so. I say 20s. It's probably 19, 20-ish. Right now, I'm just going in and figuring all of those things out and trying to figure out, okay, the flapping of the hat, we go left or right on this angle, adding shading, just overall trying to figure out the shapes of everything. And then once I do that, I then go back to editing the front, making sure everything looks nice. I make her gloves. Well, I give her gloves. Beforehand, she didn't have gloves, but I figured out, prim and proper, probably gonna wear gloves. So her hands then become gloves. I'm going in here and adding outlines, adding lighting to the ears, trying to make sure that everything is an outline. I thought maybe her ears could be rounded. Maybe we can get rid of the elf ears, as this game is still in development, so there's no need to have anything set to stone. Once I figure out the ears, I then move on to the outline of the hair, and you'll see what I mean by it looks a little wonky, but I gave it my best shot. I'm trying to keep in mind lighting and just overall overlapping everything together. I first start off with the outline, and then now I'm just thinking of highlights. So everything's in darkness, and now I'm trying to make everything in brightness. I'm trying to make it kind of look like it's curling back, and then I'm adding that bit of shine to the character. I'm going in, adding all of the shine to the hair. And then once that's done, I kind of think about maybe adding the underline again, but you can see that doesn't work, so I undo it, and I think about adding highlights as well to her hands. Also doesn't work. So I go back on that, and I'm kind of just overall trying to figure out, okay, do we need anything else? And I think for now, this is good. This is Gabriella's new sprite. I now gotta go and do tons more of these, but it's bigger, and I'm hoping it'll be better, stronger, faster, smarter, and more fun to animate. But overall, what do you think? How did it turn out? Do you like the older sprite better or the newer one? Tell me below, and yeah, I'd like to see. I'd like to see what your opinion is. Once again, thank you to Colonel for being a Patreon member of mine, and if you'd like to become one too as well, it'll be down in the description. Up there I have raw files from previous pixel art I've done, as well as time lapses. And with that, thank you for coming, thank you for joining me, and I'll see you all next week on Monday when I do another character art sprite. Alright, bye!